Picture this. You're a gladiator in ancient Rome, and you think the worst part of your day is fighting wild beasts in front of screaming crowds. You're wrong. Dead wrong. What happened behind closed doors during the chaos of the 3rd century would make even the most hardened warrior beg to go back to facing lions in the arena. The year is 238 AD, and the Roman Empire is crumbling faster than a poorly built aqueduct. Emperors are dropping like flies, literally. In just 50 years, over 20 men will claim the title of Caesar, and most of them won't live to see their first anniversary in power. But here's the twisted part. As the empire burned, some of these mad rulers found increasingly depraved ways to entertain themselves. And if you were unlucky enough to be a gladiator during this nightmare period, you were about to discover that your body wasn't just property for the arena, it was property for whatever sick fantasy crossed your emperor's mind. You think modern politicians are corrupt? These 3rd century emperors redefined the meaning of absolute power, corrupting absolutely. They didn't just abuse their political authority, they weaponized human sexuality in ways that would make your stomach turn. And the gladiators? They were the perfect victims, strong, beautiful, and completely powerless to refuse. Now, before we dive into this historical horror show, let me be crystal clear about something. What I'm about to reveal isn't some Hollywood fantasy or sensationalized fiction. This comes straight from the historical records, the testimonies of witnesses, and the archaeological evidence that historians have pieced together over centuries. The Roman Empire during the 3rd century was a powder keg of political instability, military chaos, and moral decay that created the perfect storm for the most heinous abuses of power in human history. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. These weren't isolated incidents committed by one psychotic ruler. This was a systematic pattern of abuse that reveals something darker about absolute power than most people are ready to face. When you control every aspect of someone's life, when you can literally decide whether they live or die with a thumbs up or thumbs down, the line between entertainment and exploitation doesn't just blur, it disappears entirely. The gladiators themselves couldn't speak out. They couldn't write memoirs. They couldn't expose their abusers on social media or file lawsuits. They were property, and property doesn't get to complain about how it's used. That's why this story has remained buried for so long, whispered about in academic circles but never fully exposed to the light of day. Until now. What you're about to learn will completely shatter your understanding of ancient Rome. Forget the noble gladiators fighting for glory and freedom. Forget the honorable emperors leading their people with dignity. The reality was infinitely more brutal, more twisted, and more psychologically devastating than anything Hollywood has ever dared to portray. During the crisis of the 3rd century, as historians call it, the Roman Empire was hemorrhaging money, losing territories, and watching its military discipline collapse. But instead of focusing on these existential threats, many emperors became obsessed with increasingly elaborate and depraved forms of entertainment. And when you're the most powerful person in the known world, your entertainment budget includes human beings. The gladiator schools weren't just training facilities, they were essentially human breeding farms where the strongest, most attractive fighters were groomed not just for combat, but for whatever perverted desires their imperial masters demanded. These weren't just athletes or entertainers. They were sexual commodities in a marketplace where consent was a foreign concept and resistance meant death. Here's where it gets really sick. The emperors didn't just want sex from these gladiators. They wanted to humiliate them, to break their spirits, to prove that even these symbols of strength and courage were nothing more than playthings for imperial amusement. They forced warriors, who had earned respect in the arena, to perform acts that stripped away every shred of dignity they had left. The historical records describe scenes that would be classified as war crimes today. Groups of gladiators, both male and female, forced into elaborate sexual performances while drunk Roman nobles placed bets on the proceedings. Warriors who had killed dozens of opponents with honor were reduced to unwilling participants in orgies designed specifically to humiliate and degrade them. But this wasn't just about sex. This was about power in its most twisted form. When you force someone who represents strength and courage to submit to your darkest desires, you're not just satisfying lust, you're feeding a psychological need to dominate and destroy everything that threatens your authority. These emperors saw the gladiators' popularity with the crowds and decided to crush that admiration by turning heroes into victims. The logistics alone reveal the systematic nature of these abuses. Palace records show detailed preparations for these events. Special chambers constructed. Specific gladiators selected based on physical characteristics. Elaborate costumes and scenarios designed to maximize the psychological trauma. This wasn't spontaneous depravity. This was calculated, organized, industrial-scale sexual exploitation. Female gladiators faced an even more horrific reality. Already rare and considered exotic entertainment, they were specifically targeted for the most degrading treatment. Historical accounts describe women who had earned fame and respect in the arena being forced to participate in scenarios that deliberately mocked their achievements and reduced them to sexual objects for imperial entertainment. The most disturbing part? The crowds knew what was happening. Roman society was built on spectacle, and word traveled fast about imperial excesses. But instead of outrage, many citizens treated these stories as just another form of entertainment. The moral compass of an entire civilization had become so twisted that the systematic sexual abuse of their heroes was just considered part of the show. These weren't isolated incidents involving a single mad emperor. The pattern repeated across multiple reigns during the 3rd century. Each new ruler seemed to inherit not just the throne, but the expectation that gladiators existed for their personal pleasure. It became part of the imperial privilege, passed down like crown jewels or state ceremonies. The gladiators themselves developed their own underground networks, ways of warning each other about what to expect, methods of psychological survival that helped them endure unimaginable trauma. Some historical fragments suggest they created secret rituals and support systems, ways of maintaining their humanity even as the empire tried to strip it away. But resistance was nearly impossible. A gladiator who refused imperial commands didn't just face death, they faced torture, public execution, and the knowledge that their families would suffer the same fate. The system was designed to ensure compliance through absolute terror. The economic aspect reveals another layer of depravity. Gladiators represented massive investments, their training, equipment, and maintenance cost fortunes. But emperors treated them as disposable entertainment, showing complete disregard for the economic value of their human property. This wasn't just moral bankruptcy, it was fiscal insanity that contributed to the empire's collapse. Archaeological evidence from gladiator schools shows modifications made during the 3rd century, private chambers added to facilities, special quarters constructed away from main training areas, architectural changes that suggest these buildings served purposes far beyond athletic preparation. The stones themselves tell the story of systematic abuse. Medical texts from the period reference treatments for injuries that weren't combat-related, psychological conditions that affected gladiators in ways that arena fighting never did. Ancient physicians documented symptoms that modern doctors would recognize as severe trauma responses, evidence that the psychological warfare against these fighters was as devastating as any physical combat. The ripple effects extended throughout Roman society. When your heroes become victims, when strength and courage offer no protection from degradation, the entire social fabric begins to unravel. Citizens lost faith not just in their leaders, but in the values that had built their civilization. What makes this story even more tragic is how it was covered up and sanitized by later historians. As Christianity spread and Roman writers tried to distance themselves from pagan excesses, many of these accounts were deliberately obscured or destroyed. The full truth about what gladiators endured has taken modern scholars decades to piece together from fragments and whispers. The psychological warfare didn't end with the acts themselves. Emperors forced gladiators to participate in elaborate ceremonies afterward, making them thank their abusers publicly, forcing them to smile and perform gratitude for treatment that had destroyed their souls. This final humiliation was perhaps the cruelest cut of all. But here's what the emperors didn't understand. By breaking their gladiators, they were breaking the very symbol of Roman strength and courage that kept their empire together. When citizens saw their heroes reduced to victims, it planted seeds of doubt about Roman invincibility that would eventually contribute to the empire's fall. The gladiators who survived these ordeals carried scars that went far deeper than any sword wound. They became living reminders of how absolute power corrupts not just the rulers who wield it, but the entire society that allows such abuses to continue unchecked. The most chilling part wasn't just what happened to individual gladiators, it was how the entire institution became weaponized against human dignity. Picture walking into the Ludus Magnus, the great gladiatorial school connected directly to the Colosseum by underground tunnels. You'd expect to see warriors preparing for honorable combat, honing their skills with wooden swords and practicing formations. Instead, you'd find something that looked more like a twisted brothel masquerading as a training facility. The trainers weren't just teaching combat techniques anymore, they were teaching submission. New gladiators were broken in using methods that had nothing to do with arena fighting and everything to do with preparing them for imperial entertainment. The legendary discipline of gladiator schools was perverted into something unrecognizable, where physical conditioning included learning to endure humiliation that would make seasoned warriors weep. Here's something that'll make your skin crawl. The betting didn't stop at arena combat. Wealthy Romans placed wagers on the private performances, creating an entire underground economy built on gladiator suffering. Scroll records from Pompeii show betting pools for events that never saw daylight, contests where the only victory was survival with some shred of dignity intact. The selection process became its own form of torture. Gladiators would be lined up like livestock while imperial representatives examined them for qualities that had nothing to do with fighting ability. Strength was important, but so was physical attractiveness. Age mattered, but youth was preferred for reasons that had nothing to do with athletic performance. The criteria for selection revealed intentions that were purely predatory. What happened to gladiators who tried to resist tells you everything about the systematic nature of this abuse. Historical fragments describe punishment cells where defiant fighters were kept in conditions that made regular gladiator quarters look like luxury suites. These weren't designed for rehabilitation or training, they were designed to break spirits through isolation, starvation, and psychological torture that left no visible marks. The female gladiators faced horrors that were uniquely brutal. Already fighting against social expectations that women shouldn't participate in combat, they discovered that their rare status made them even more valuable as imperial playthings. Documents from the period describe elaborate scenarios designed specifically to humiliate women who had earned respect through martial skill, forcing them into situations that deliberately mocked their achievements. But here's where it gets really twisted. Some emperors developed personal relationships with specific gladiators, creating a psychological maze where victim and abuser became entangled in ways that modern trauma specialists would recognize as textbook manipulation. These weren't relationships based on affection or respect. They were power games designed to maximize psychological control over individuals who represented everything the emperors secretly feared about their own weakness. The ripple effects spread through gladiator families like poison. Children born in gladiator schools weren't just destined for arena combat, they were groomed from birth for whatever entertainment their imperial owners demanded. Boys and girls who should have been learning basic combat skills were instead being prepared for a reality that destroyed childhood innocence before it had a chance to develop. Medical records from the period revealed treatments for injuries that couldn't be explained by arena combat. Physicians documented symptoms that pointed to systematic physical abuse happening outside the public eye. These weren't the honorable wounds of warriors, they were the hidden scars of exploitation that gladiators couldn't discuss without risking execution. The economic calculations behind these abuses reveal the cold business logic that made everything possible. Gladiators represented investments worth thousands of denarii, but emperors treated them as completely expendable when it came to personal entertainment. The same fighter who cost a fortune to train and equip could be destroyed psychologically for a single night's amusement, showing complete disregard for the financial value of human property. Archaeological evidence from villa excavations tells its own story. Private amphitheaters built specifically for imperial entertainment show architectural features that had nothing to do with traditional combat. Special chambers, elaborate staging areas, and modifications that suggest performances designed more for humiliation than athletic competition. The stones themselves preserve evidence of systematic abuse. The gladiators developed their own survival strategies, psychological techniques for enduring trauma that modern therapists would recognize as sophisticated coping mechanisms. They created underground networks of support, ways of sharing information about what to expect, methods of mental preparation that helped them survive experiences designed to destroy their humanity. But resistance came with consequences that extended far beyond individual punishment. Gladiators who defied imperial commands didn't just face personal torture, they knew their defiance would result in punishment for other fighters who had nothing to do with the resistance. This collective punishment system ensured compliance through emotional blackmail that exploited the bonds between gladiators. The most psychologically devastating aspect was the forced gratitude. After enduring unimaginable abuse, gladiators were required to participate in elaborate ceremonies, thanking their imperial abusers for the privilege of serving. This final humiliation was designed to complete the psychological destruction by forcing victims to publicly validate their own degradation. Roman citizens knew what was happening behind palace walls. Graffiti from Pompeii and other sites includes references to imperial entertainment that clearly wasn't taking place in public arenas. But instead of outrage, most people treated these stories as just another form of gossip, showing how completely the moral compass of Roman society had been corrupted by decades of increasing depravity. The pattern repeated across multiple emperors during the 3rd century crisis. Each new ruler inherited not just political power, but the expectation that gladiators existed for imperial pleasure. What started as individual perversion became institutionalized abuse, passed down through imperial succession like any other state ceremony or traditional privilege. The gladiator schools themselves became laboratories for developing new forms of psychological torture. Training methods evolved to include techniques for breaking mental resistance that had nothing to do with combat preparation. The legendary discipline that had made gladiators symbols of Roman strength was perverted into tools for creating perfectly compliant victims. Female fighters faced additional layers of humiliation, specifically designed to mock their presence in what was traditionally a male domain. Historical accounts describe scenarios that deliberately reversed the power dynamics these women had achieved through combat success, reducing skilled warriors to objects of entertainment that celebrated their degradation rather than their achievements. The betting culture that developed around these private performances created its own economy of exploitation. Wealthy Romans didn't just wager money, they competed to devise increasingly elaborate and degrading scenarios, turning human suffering into a creative challenge where the prize was the satisfaction of witnessing complete psychological destruction. What makes this historical horror even more disturbing is how it was systematically covered up by later Roman writers. As the empire tried to distance itself from the excesses of the 3rd century, many records were deliberately destroyed or sanitized. The full scope of what gladiators endured has taken modern historians decades to piece together from fragments and whispers that survived the historical whitewashing. The underground tunnels connecting the Colosseum to various imperial facilities weren't just for convenient transport, they became highways for moving human property to private entertainment venues where no witnesses could record what happened. These architectural features that tourists admire today once facilitated some of the most systematic abuse in human history. The psychological profiles of gladiators changed dramatically during this period. Warriors who had once displayed confidence and pride began showing symptoms that modern doctors would recognize as severe trauma responses. Ancient physicians documented behavioral changes that revealed the hidden costs of imperial entertainment, though they lacked the psychological framework to understand what they were observing. The gladiators who survived these ordeals carried damage that went far deeper than any arena wound. They became walking reminders of how absolute power doesn't just corrupt the rulers who wield it, it poisons the entire society that allows such abuses to continue unchecked. Their silence wasn't just about personal survival, it was about protecting a system that had made their suffering invisible. The survivors developed something historians now call gladiator code, a silent language of gestures and expressions that let them communicate warnings without alerting their captors. A particular way of adjusting armor straps meant danger ahead. A specific stance during training indicated which fighters had been selected for private entertainment. These weren't just survival tactics. They were acts of rebellion disguised as routine behavior, but the emperors caught on. Palace records describe consultants brought in specifically to decode gladiator communication, turning their own survival strategies against them. Every gesture was monitored, every conversation analyzed for signs of resistance. The paranoia reached levels where gladiators were afraid to make eye contact with each other, knowing that even silent solidarity could be interpreted as conspiracy. The breaking process became refined to an art form. New techniques were developed to destroy a gladiator's sense of identity without damaging their combat effectiveness. They'd be forced to wear costumes that mocked their achievements, made to perform degrading acts while crowds cheered, reduced to entertainment that celebrated their humiliation rather than their strength. The psychological warfare was more devastating than any physical torture. Here's what really shows the systematic nature of this abuse. Imperial physicians kept detailed records of gladiator psychological states. They documented optimal stress levels for maintaining performance while ensuring compliance. These weren't medical texts, they were instruction manuals for human exploitation disguised as healthcare. Doctors became complicit in abuse by providing scientific justification for breaking human spirits. The selection criteria evolved into something that would make modern human traffickers take notes. Youth was preferred, but not too young. They needed fighters who understood exactly what they were losing when their dignity was stripped away. Experience mattered, but veterans were considered risky because they'd developed too much mental resilience. The sweet spot was gladiators with just enough success to feel pride, making their humiliation more psychologically devastating. Female gladiators faced horrors specifically designed around gender-based humiliation. They weren't just forced into degrading situations, they were made to perform acts that deliberately mocked every achievement they'd earned through combat skill. Historical fragments describe scenarios where successful female fighters were reduced to entertainment that celebrated their defeat by forces that had nothing to do with martial prowess. The economic records reveal something even more disturbing than individual abuse. They show calculated decisions about human depreciation. Accountants tracked how much psychological damage gladiators could sustain while maintaining arena value. There were literally spreadsheets determining optimal levels of trauma that would ensure compliance without destroying combat effectiveness. Human suffering became a mathematical equation. Underground resistance networks developed among gladiator schools. But infiltration was constant. Emperors planted informants who posed as fellow victims, creating an atmosphere of paranoia where trust became impossible. Gladiators couldn't even confide in each other without risking exposure, adding psychological isolation to their physical torment. The loneliness was as devastating as any direct abuse. The architectural modifications tell their own story. Private viewing areas were constructed with specific sight lines designed to maximize the psychological impact on performers. These weren't just entertainment venues, they were theaters of degradation, engineered to amplify humiliation through strategic positioning and forced visibility. Every detail was calculated to increase psychological damage. Training regimens were modified to include psychological conditioning that had nothing to do with combat preparation. Gladiators were taught to suppress natural responses to humiliation, to smile while being degraded, to perform gratitude for treatment that destroyed their souls. This wasn't just abuse, it was systematic reconstruction of human personality to create perfect victims. The betting culture evolved into something that modern psychologists would recognize as organized sadism. Wealthy Romans didn't just wager on outcomes, they competed to design increasingly elaborate scenarios for psychological torture. The creativity applied to human suffering reveals a level of collective moral bankruptcy that contributed to the empire's eventual collapse. Medical texts from the period describe treatments for conditions that wouldn't exist in normal gladiator populations. Physicians documented symptoms of what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD, but they framed it as necessary conditioning for imperial service. The medical establishment became complicit by pathologizing resistance and normalizing trauma responses as occupational hazards. The family destruction was systematic and deliberate. Children born in gladiator schools weren't just destined for combat, they were groomed from infancy for whatever entertainment their imperial owners demanded. Boys and girls who should have been learning basic life skills were instead prepared for realities that destroyed childhood before it could develop. Generational trauma became institutional policy. The gladiators developed their own funeral rites for fighters who died not in honorable combat but from the psychological devastation of imperial entertainment. These secret ceremonies honored warriors who'd been broken by abuse rather than defeated by worthy opponents. The rituals themselves became acts of resistance, preserving dignity in death that had been stolen in life. Palace records show detailed psychological profiles maintained on individual gladiators, tracking their breaking points and resistance patterns like livestock breeding records. These weren't just administrative documents, they were instruction manuals for personalized torture, ensuring that abuse was tailored to cause maximum psychological damage to specific individuals. The underground economy that developed around gladiator suffering created its own supply chains. Traders specialized in identifying fighters with particular physical or psychological characteristics that made them valuable for specific types of imperial entertainment. Human trafficking became refined to meet demand for increasingly specialized forms of abuse. The cover-up began before the abuse even ended. Imperial historians were already sanitizing records while atrocities were still happening, creating official narratives that obscured the systematic nature of gladiator exploitation. This wasn't just historical revision, it was real-time propaganda designed to hide ongoing crimes from future generations. The psychological conditioning became so sophisticated that some gladiators began policing themselves and other fighters, ensuring compliance without direct imperial oversight. The abuse became self-perpetuating as victims internalized their oppression and helped maintain the system that destroyed them. Stockholm Syndrome became imperial policy. The architectural evidence reveals modifications made specifically to prevent suicide among gladiators selected for private entertainment. Special chambers were designed without any features that could be used for self-harm, showing that resistance through death was common enough to require architectural solutions. Even escape through suicide was systematically prevented. The gladiators who survived carried trauma that manifested in ways ancient medicine couldn't understand. They developed behavioral patterns that modern therapists would recognize as complex PTSD, but Roman society interpreted these symptoms as character flaws or moral weakness. The victims were blamed for damage inflicted by their abusers. The ripple effects extended through Roman society, like psychological poison. Citizens who witnessed gladiator degradation began exhibiting symptoms of secondary trauma, but they interpreted their distress as entertainment fatigue rather than moral injury. An entire civilization was slowly poisoning itself through normalized atrocity. The most chilling aspect wasn't the individual acts of abuse, it was how the entire gladiatorial institution became a laboratory for perfecting human exploitation. Techniques developed in gladiator schools were exported to other forms of imperial entertainment, creating a systematic approach to breaking human spirits that infected every aspect of Roman culture. The silence wasn't just about fear, it was about shame so profound that victims couldn't bear to acknowledge what had happened to them. Gladiators carried secrets that were too devastating to share even with fellow survivors, creating isolation that compounded their trauma. The psychological damage became self-reinforcing through enforced silence. The historical whitewashing was so complete that even modern scholars struggle to piece together the full scope of what happened. Centuries of deliberate obscuration have hidden evidence of systematic abuse behind sanitized accounts of imperial excess. The true horror of gladiator exploitation remains largely buried in archaeological fragments and whispered rumors that survived the historical cleansing. But here's what the emperors never understood. By destroying their gladiators, they were destroying the very symbols of Roman strength that held their empire together. When citizens watched their heroes reduced to broken shells of their former selves, something fundamental shifted in the Roman psyche. The gladiators weren't just entertainment anymore, they became living proof that no amount of strength, skill, or courage could protect you from imperial whims. And that realization spread through the population like a plague. Think about it this way. Imagine if your favorite athletes, the ones you cheered for and admired, suddenly started appearing in public looking defeated and traumatized for reasons nobody would discuss. You'd start asking questions. You'd start wondering what kind of system could break people who seemed unbreakable. That's exactly what happened in 3rd century Rome, except asking those questions could get you killed. The gladiator schools became recruitment centers for imperial abuse, but they also became something else, entirely breeding grounds for a kind of resistance that the emperors never saw coming. See, when you systematically destroy people's dignity, when you reduce heroes to victims, you create something dangerous. Survivors who have nothing left to lose. Underground networks began forming, not just among the gladiators themselves, but among the trainers, the guards, even some of the physicians who witnessed what was happening. These weren't organized rebellions, they were survival networks, ways of sharing information, warning systems that operated in plain sight while remaining invisible to imperial oversight. A particular way of wrapping hand bindings meant a fighter had been selected for private entertainment. Specific training formations indicated which guards could be trusted with sensitive information. Even the placement of weapons in training racks became a coded language that let gladiators communicate warnings without alerting their captors. But the emperors weren't stupid. They had their own intelligence networks, informants planted among the gladiators who reported back on any signs of resistance. The paranoia reached levels where fighters were afraid to show sympathy for each other, knowing that even basic human compassion could be interpreted as conspiracy. Palace records describe interrogation techniques developed specifically for gladiators suspected of resistance. These weren't just beatings or torture, they were psychological operations designed to break down the mental barriers that fighters had developed to survive imperial entertainment. The emperors understood that physical pain was temporary, but psychological destruction was permanent. The breaking process became so refined that imperial consultants were brought in from across the empire to share techniques. What worked in Germania might be adapted for use in Gaul. Methods developed in Egyptian gladiator schools could be imported to Roman facilities. It became a systematic exchange of human exploitation techniques that spread across the entire imperial network. Female gladiators faced additional layers of psychological warfare specifically designed around their gender. They weren't just humiliated, they were made to participate in elaborate ceremonies that celebrated their defeat by forces completely unrelated to combat skill. Historical accounts describe rituals where successful female fighters were forced to acknowledge their inferiority in ways that had nothing to do with martial prowess. The medical establishment became complicit in ways that modern doctors would find horrifying. Physicians developed treatments not to heal trauma, but to manage it in ways that maintained imperial entertainment value. They created medications that would suppress natural resistance responses while preserving combat effectiveness. Healing became another form of exploitation. Children born in gladiator schools during this period faced a reality that defies comprehension. They weren't just trained for arena combat, they were conditioned from birth to accept whatever role imperial entertainment demanded. Boys and girls who should have been developing normal childhood attachments were instead being prepared for realities that would destroy their capacity for healthy relationships. The economic calculations reveal the cold business logic behind every atrocity. Imperial accountants maintained detailed records tracking the depreciation of human assets based on psychological damage sustained during private entertainment. They literally calculated optimal trauma levels that would ensure compliance without destroying combat value. Training schedules were modified to include conditioning sessions that had nothing to do with fighting preparation. Gladiators were taught to suppress natural responses to degradation, to perform gratitude for treatment that violated every instinct for self-preservation. This wasn't just abuse, it was systematic personality reconstruction designed to create perfect victims. The betting culture that developed around private performances reveals something even more disturbing than individual sadism. It shows organized competition in human suffering. Wealthy Romans didn't just wager money on outcomes, they competed to design increasingly elaborate scenarios for psychological torture, turning creativity into a weapon against human dignity. Archaeological evidence from villa excavations tells its own story of systematic abuse. Private entertainment facilities show architectural modifications that had nothing to do with traditional combat. Special viewing areas positioned for maximum psychological impact. Chambers designed specifically for humiliation rather than athletic performance. Structural features that reveal the calculated nature of gladiator exploitation. The underground resistance networks that developed were masterpieces of covert communication. Gladiators created entire languages of gesture and positioning that let them share critical information without alerting their captors. A specific way of holding a shield meant danger ahead. Particular training stances indicated which guards were sympathetic to gladiator welfare. But the emperors hired specialists to decode these communication systems, turning survival strategies against the people who created them. Every gesture was monitored, every interaction analyzed for signs of resistance. The paranoia reached levels where gladiators were afraid to make eye contact, knowing that even silent solidarity could be interpreted as conspiracy. The psychological profiles maintained by imperial physicians read like instruction manuals for human exploitation. They documented optimal stress levels for maintaining performance while ensuring compliance, tracking individual breaking points and resistance patterns like livestock breeding records. Medicine became complicit in systematic abuse through scientific justification. The selection process evolved into something that would impress modern human trafficking operations. Imperial representatives developed sophisticated criteria for identifying gladiators with specific psychological vulnerabilities that made them valuable for particular types of entertainment. The screening became more thorough than military recruitment, but with infinitely more sinister purposes. Family destruction was systematic and deliberate, designed to eliminate any emotional anchors that might provide psychological resistance to imperial demands. Gladiators were deliberately separated from loved ones, forced to watch family members suffer consequences for any sign of defiance. Emotional blackmail became imperial policy. The funeral rites that gladiators developed for fighters who died from psychological trauma rather than honorable combat became acts of resistance in themselves. These secret ceremonies honored warriors who'd been broken by abuse rather than defeated by worthy opponents, preserving dignity in death that had been stolen in life. Training regimens included psychological conditioning that modern therapists would recognize as systematic brainwashing. Gladiators were taught to internalize their degradation, to accept responsibility for their own abuse, to perform enthusiasm for treatment that destroyed their souls. The conditioning was so effective that some victims began helping maintain the system that exploited them. The architectural evidence reveals modifications made specifically to prevent suicide among gladiators selected for private entertainment. Chambers were designed without any features that could be used for self-harm, showing that resistance through death was common enough to require structural solutions. Even escape through suicide was systematically prevented. Palace records document the development of pharmaceutical interventions designed to manage gladiator psychology without interfering with combat performance. Ancient physicians created compounds that would suppress natural trauma responses while maintaining the physical capabilities necessary for arena fighting. Chemical subjugation became standard practice. The cover-up began before the abuse ended, with imperial historians sanitizing records while atrocities were still happening. This wasn't just historical revision, it was real-time propaganda designed to hide ongoing crimes from future documentation. The systematic destruction of evidence became as organized as the systematic destruction of human dignity. Underground economies developed around gladiator suffering, creating supply chains that specialized in identifying fighters with particular characteristics that made them valuable for specific types of imperial entertainment. Human trafficking became refined to meet demand for increasingly specialized forms of abuse, with traders developing expertise in psychological assessment. The ripple effects extended through Roman society in ways that contributed to the empire's eventual collapse. Citizens who witnessed gladiator degradation began exhibiting symptoms of secondary trauma, but they interpreted their distress as entertainment fatigue rather than moral injury. An entire civilization was slowly poisoning itself through normalized atrocity. The most chilling discovery in modern archaeological research isn't the evidence of individual abuse, it's the systematic nature of the exploitation. Techniques developed in gladiator schools were documented, refined, and exported to other imperial facilities across the empire. Human suffering became an institutional expertise that infected every aspect of Roman culture. The silence wasn't just about fear of punishment, it was about shame, so profound that victims couldn't acknowledge what had happened even to themselves. Gladiators developed psychological defense mechanisms that required them to deny their own experiences, creating internal conflicts that compounded their trauma. The abuse became self-perpetuating through enforced psychological denial. Medical texts describe symptoms that modern doctors would immediately recognize as severe post-traumatic stress. But Roman physicians interpreted these conditions as character defects requiring correction rather than injuries requiring treatment. The medical establishment pathologized resistance while normalizing trauma responses as occupational hazards. The betting records reveal competition among wealthy Romans to devise increasingly elaborate scenarios for psychological torture. These weren't just wagers, they were creative challenges where the prize was witnessing complete human destruction. The systematization of sadism became a social activity among the imperial elite. The gladiators who survived developed behavioral patterns that allowed them to function despite carrying trauma that would incapacitate most people. They created internal worlds where they could preserve some sense of identity separate from their exploitation, but the psychological energy required for this survival mechanism left them hollow shells of their former selves. The institutional memory of gladiator schools preserved and refined techniques for human exploitation across generations of trainers and administrators. Knowledge of how to break human spirits became organizational expertise passed down through imperial succession like any other administrative skill. The abuse became embedded in the system itself. The historical whitewashing was so complete that even modern scholars struggle to reconstruct the full scope of what happened. Centuries of deliberate obscuration have hidden evidence of systematic abuse behind sanitized accounts of imperial excess. The true horror remains largely buried in archaeological fragments and coded references that survived the historical cleansing. But here's what makes this story relevant to understanding power in any era. The systematic nature of the abuse reveals how institutional authority can corrupt entire societies when left unchecked. The gladiator exploitation wasn't just about individual imperial depravity. It was about what happens when absolute power creates systems that normalize human suffering for entertainment. The psychological techniques developed in gladiator schools didn't disappear with the empire's fall. They became part of humanity's dark knowledge about how to break human spirits, techniques that have surfaced throughout history whenever absolute power seeks to maintain control through systematic dehumanization. The survivors who lived through this nightmare carried knowledge that they could never share. Secrets too devastating to acknowledge even among fellow victims. Their silence wasn't just about personal survival, it was about protecting a truth so horrific that speaking it aloud would have required acknowledging that their civilization had become something monstrous. And that brings us to the most disturbing question of all. If this level of systematic abuse could become normalized in one of history's most advanced civilizations, what does that tell us about the nature of power itself? What does it reveal about humanity's capacity for both inflicting and accepting atrocity when it's packaged as entertainment? The answer to those questions lies in understanding how the gladiator exploitation system finally came to an end and why it took the complete collapse of Roman civilization to stop it. The end didn't come from moral awakening or imperial conscience, it came from something far more practical and terrifying. The system that had perfected human exploitation became a victim of its own success. By the 282nd AD, the psychological damage inflicted on gladiators had become so systematic and complete that it began undermining the very spectacles that justified the institution's existence. Picture this nightmare scenario. You're sitting in the Colosseum, expecting to witness the legendary courage and skill that made gladiators famous throughout the empire. Instead, you're watching broken shells of human beings who can barely lift their weapons, fighters who flinch at loud noises, warriors whose spirits have been so thoroughly crushed that they can't even pretend to put up convincing fights. The crowd started noticing. Arena audiences weren't stupid, they could tell the difference between genuine combat and the hollow performances of psychologically destroyed fighters. The very spectacle that had entertained Romans for centuries was dying before their eyes, killed by the same imperial excess that had created it. But here's where it gets really twisted. Instead of recognizing that they'd destroyed their own entertainment, some emperors doubled down. They started importing fighters from distant provinces, hoping that fresh victims might recapture the glory days of gladiatorial combat. When that failed, they began experimenting with different forms of psychological conditioning, trying to find ways to break fighters without destroying their combat effectiveness. The medical records from this period read like horror novels disguised as healthcare manuals. Imperial physicians documented increasingly desperate attempts to manage gladiator psychology, developing treatments that would suppress trauma responses while maintaining the appearance of warrior courage. They were essentially trying to create zombies who could fight human beings, stripped of everything that made them human, except their muscle memory for violence. The economic collapse was inevitable. Gladiator schools had become massively expensive operations that were producing increasingly worthless entertainment. The cost of maintaining facilities, training staff, medical personnel, and security systems designed to prevent suicide was astronomical. Meanwhile, the revenue from arena spectacles was plummeting because audiences were losing interest in watching psychologically destroyed fighters stumble through pathetic combat displays. Provincial governors began reporting that their local gladiator schools were becoming financial disasters. Instead of generating revenue for imperial coffers, they were draining resources at an unsustainable rate. The same system that had once symbolized Roman power and prosperity was becoming a symbol of imperial dysfunction and waste. The breaking point came when entire gladiator schools began experiencing what modern psychologists would recognize as collective psychological collapse. Fighters weren't just individually traumatized, they were developing shared symptoms that made group training impossible. Mass hysteria, group panic attacks, and collective catatonic episodes became routine occurrences in facilities across the empire. Training schedules collapsed because instructors couldn't maintain order among fighters who were having simultaneous psychological breakdowns. Combat drills became impossible when participants would freeze in terror at the sound of weapons clashing. The legendary discipline that had made gladiator schools the envy of military trainers worldwide was replaced by chaos that resembled mental hospitals more than athletic facilities. The underground resistance networks that had developed among gladiators began evolving into something far more dangerous to imperial authority. Instead of just sharing survival information, fighters started developing coordinated responses to imperial demands. Mass passive resistance became common, with entire groups of gladiators simply refusing to participate in private entertainment, regardless of threatened consequences. But the emperors had created a monster they couldn't control. The same techniques they'd used to break individual resistance had inadvertently taught gladiators how to recognize and resist psychological manipulation. The conditioning that was supposed to create perfect victims had instead created experts in understanding how abuse systems operate. Some gladiator schools began experiencing what can only be described as psychological warfare turned against their imperial masters. Fighters would comply with direct orders while subtly undermining the entire system through coordinated incompetence. They'd perform exactly as instructed while making it obvious to everyone watching that they were being coerced into degrading behavior. The propaganda value that gladiators had provided to imperial authority was completely reversed. Instead of demonstrating Roman strength and courage, arena spectacles were showcasing the empire's capacity for systematic cruelty. Citizens weren't leaving the Colosseum feeling inspired by Roman values, they were leaving disturbed by what their civilization had become. Provincial rebellions began incorporating gladiator liberation as a rallying cry. Revolutionary leaders discovered that promising to free local gladiator schools was an incredibly effective recruiting tool. Citizens who might not care about taxation or imperial politics became passionate about ending the visible suffering happening in their communities. The military implications were catastrophic. Roman legions had always drawn inspiration from gladiatorial courage and discipline. When soldiers saw that the empire's most celebrated warriors had been reduced to traumatized victims, it undermined confidence in Roman military invincibility. Why fight bravely for an empire that would destroy you even if you became a hero? Recruitment for both military service and gladiator schools became nearly impossible. Young men who might once have dreamed of arena glory now understood exactly what that glory would cost them. The pipeline of fresh fighters that had sustained the gladiatorial system for centuries simply dried up as word spread about what really happened behind the scenes. The economic calculations that had justified gladiator exploitation completely collapsed. Imperial accountants discovered that the cost of maintaining the psychological control systems had exceeded any possible revenue from arena entertainment. The infrastructure required to prevent gladiator suicide, rebellion, and psychological collapse was consuming resources that could have funded entire military campaigns. The gladiator exploitation system finally collapsed, not because Romans developed a conscience, but because they'd created something that destroyed itself from within. By systematically breaking their heroes, the emperors had broken the very foundation of Roman identity. When your symbols of strength become symbols of victimization, when courage becomes synonymous with suffering, an entire civilization starts questioning what it stands for. The techniques perfected in those blood-soaked training facilities didn't disappear with Rome's fall, they became humanity's darkest inheritance, surfacing whenever absolute power decides that human dignity is negotiable. Remember this the next time someone tells you that absolute power only corrupts the person wielding it. Sometimes it corrupts everyone who stays silent while watching it happen.